So the last few weeks, we have been looking through Revelation chapters 4 and chapter 5. And in chapters 4 and 5, we saw this glimpse, if you will, this vision of heaven. Chapter 4 was a scene of the throne room of God, if you will. God the Father on the throne, described as this just beautiful, reflected light. And we saw everything centered around the throne of God, the elders, the four creatures, and he is receiving worship. In chapter 5, which we've been looking at for the last couple of weeks, we have a new actor on the scene, so to speak. And there is this picture of God the Father on the throne, and then God the Son shows up. And what happens is, in chapter 5, Christ takes this scroll, he takes this word from the hand of the Father. He moves towards the center, and all those who have been worshiping the Father now also include and begin to sing a new song at the end of chapter 5, worshiping Christ. And the worship of Christ, as he takes the scroll from God the Father, is centered around mostly the idea that he is worthy to do all that he's about to do. He's worthy to reign. He's worthy to have authority. He's worthy to take the scroll and to execute, if you will, the plans of God, because he was obedient to the point of death. He was crucified and he became resurrected. And because he did all those things, because he is the Lamb, he is now worthy to take the plans of God as exhibited in this scroll, which is getting ready to get opened tonight, and he's worthy to take and to rule and to reign. If you remember some of the last words of Christ, we have them recorded in what we call the Great Commission at the end of the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus begins that by saying, all authority is given to me in heaven and earth. Well, what we see in Revelation 5 is kind of the official, if you will, investiture, the handing over, the investing in Christ, the authority to do all that God the Father has set aside for him to do. So all that took place in Revelation 4 and 5. And as we begin now in Revelation 6, as we begin this whole sequence of things that are going to take place that look to us we are now what the world would call apocalyptic stuff, the end of the world type stuff that we might think of. As we get to all of that, we understand that all that flows out of the fact that God the Father and God the Son, God the Holy Spirit are in fact reigning. They are in charge. Nothing that happens without their permission. And so as we are pulling back the curtain, which is what Revelation is doing, it's a revealing of the truth behind the things that we see on earth. Because for you and I, when we see things happen on earth, especially things that seem somewhat scary or dramatic, we can find ourselves asking the question, why is this happening? Where is God? What's the point? And what Revelation is doing, of course, is pulling back that curtain and revealing to us the heavenly spiritual realities behind the events that will be taking place on earth. So, that's the setup as we come now into Revelation chapter 6. We're going to read this chapter, it's not a real long one, and then we're going to find ourselves going in a couple different places here as we look for some context and for some meaning. Revelation chapter 6. Then I saw when the Lamb broke one of the seven seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures saying as with a voice of thunder, "Come." I looked, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. When he broke the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, "Come." And another, a red horse, went out, and to him who sat on it was granted to take peace from the earth, and that men would slay one another, and a great sword was given to him. When he broke the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard something like a voice in the center of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3/4 of barley for a denarius, and do not damage the oil and the wine." When the Lamb broke the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature saying, "Come." I looked, and behold, an ashen horse, and he who sat on it had the name Death. And Hades was following with him. Authority was given to them over a fourth of the earth to kill with the sword, and with famine, and with pestilence, and by the wild beasts of the earth. When the Lamb broke the fifth seal, I saw underneath the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God, and because of the testimony which they had maintained. And they cried out with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, will you refrain from judging and avenging our blood on those who dwell on the earth? And there was given to each of them a white robe, and they were told that they should rest for a little while longer, until the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who were to be killed, even as they had been, would be completed also. I looked when he broke the sixth seal, and there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth made of hair, and the whole moon became like blood. And the stars of the sky fell to the earth as a fig tree casts its unripe figs when shaken by a great wind. The sky was split apart like a scroll when it's rolled up, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. Then the kings of the earth and the great men and the commanders and the rich and the strong and every slave and free man hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and to the rocks, Fall on us, hide us from the presence of the Lord, of him who sits on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? Now, these are probably things that we have heard of or talked about or read about, things that we all, of course, associate with the end of the world as we think about it. Now, before we get too much farther into what's taking place in the seals and all that takes place in the next several chapters, I want to briefly take you to Revelation 21, near the end of the book, because we need to keep this in mind. In Revelation 21, verse 1, here's what's written. I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there was no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. I'm going to pause there. We know that the end of Revelation is pointing us to a new heaven and a new earth, and that this is where we're going to dwell for eternity. And so what's happening between, say, Revelation 6 and Revelation 21 is the process that God has set aside to, if you will, birth that new heaven and that new earth. That's the goal. We're moving from the destruction of this earth to the birth of a new one. What story in the Bible might this sound a little bit like? If we're thinking about worldwide judgment here. Yeah, the flood. I mean, let's go all the way back to Genesis chapter 6. Now, we realize it's not the exact same thing, but in Genesis chapter 6, 7, 8, you've got the account of Noah and the worldwide flood. And for all practical purposes, Noah and his family enter the ark with the world looking one way and feeling one way and being one way, and they come out of that thing with the world being something completely different. And that process began with God coming to Noah, God giving Noah some instructions, Noah spending 100 years building the ark, and then all the 40 days of rain and flooding, all that whole thing. Well, in some ways, this is a similar process. So as we begin the seals of chapter 6, we're moving towards this idea of birthing a new heaven and a new earth. Now, why am I using that phraseology? Why am I pointing us to that? Because if you, having reading this, if you are familiar with what sometimes is called the Olivet Discourse, this is a question and answer session that Jesus had with his disciples at the end of the Gospel of Matthew. So I want to take us there real quick too. Matthew chapter 24. These are all related. And so we want to have an understanding, or we want to have a working knowledge of all these things as they work together. In Matthew chapter 24, the disciples ask Jesus essentially when the end of the world is going to happen, what's going to take place. And verse 4 of Matthew 24, Jesus answered and said to them, See to it that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not frightened, for these things must take place, but that's not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of the birth pangs. Now I'm going to pause there. Now, if we were to look at that just description right there in Matthew 24 and compare it to what we just read in Revelation chapter 6, what will we see? It's a pretty similar thing, isn't it? Revelation 6, we have We have wars. We have conflicts. We have pestilence, disease. We have death. Matthew 24, we have wars, rumors of wars. We have nation rising against nation. We have famines, earthquakes. Sounds kind of familiar? In fact, if we read through the entirety of Matthew 24 and Revelation 6, Luke 21 is the same thing. What we're going to see is a remarkable similarity. A lot of the same things are being described. And Jesus describes all these things what there in Matthew chapter 24, verse 5, 6. He says, is this the end? No. He says, this is just what? Birth pains. All right. I have no idea what that feels like. I've been in the room, but I don't know what it feels like. But we kind of know what the process looks like, don't we? When a lady approaches that time when birth is not too far away, they begin to have what some folks call Braxton Hicks contractions. And what are those contractions? Are those the actual birth? No, they're just signs that the birth is coming, right? So you have those false contractions for a while. They get a little more intense, they get a little worse, they go away, and they come and they go away, right? And then sooner or later come the real thing. But even the real thing, do the initial contractions mean that the birth is right there? Okay. It probably means that it's on the way, but it's getting closer. The pain's a little, ladies, I'm assuming the pain's different at that point. I'm assuming. But it comes in waves. It comes repeatedly. More intense, I assume, the closer you get. We have drugs now they didn't have back then. But you guys get the idea. Well, I don't have to explain it to you. You guys know the idea. So, this is the analogy that Jesus is using to describe what's going to be happening in the end days, that there are going to be early warning signs, painful episodes, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the end of the world yet. It just might mean that things are moving that direction. The reality is God's people have for 2,000 years been thinking that they were right around the corner from the end days. Now, sooner or later we will be. But if the people who are hearing this, those 7 churches that we read about in chapters 2 and 3, those churches are hearing this vision of John, probably believing that they're within a few years of this, if not right there in the middle of it. And so those contractions, those birth pains come. And over time, whether we see the 7 seals followed by the 7 trumpets and the 7 bowls, think of these as waves of contractions, waves of birth pains, and with each one, with each group of them, you're getting closer, but they're similar. They feel alike, and they are going to take us to the image. Jesus describes these things in Matthew 24 as not the end, but the beginning of the birth pains, not the birth itself. So when we get to chapter 6 of Revelation, the reason I pull this together is this. Chapter 6, the seals are not the judgments themselves. All right? So remember chapter 5, what we have here. What are these seals that are being opened? What are they on? Yeah, they're on a scroll. So in chapter 5, God the Father on the throne has a scroll in his hand. The Son, the Lamb, comes up and takes that scroll. So we talked about that the last couple of weeks. As Christ now takes that scroll has 7 seals on it. Now that, to kind of go with the image of that day and age, there would have been a wax seal that would have had a signet ring kind of put into it. That was made in an official document in Roman times. So there would have been 7 of these wax seals. And what's happening is, the visual here is that Jesus is popping open the seals as he goes down. So, are the seals the contents of the scroll? No. What are they? They're just the opening of the scroll. They're not the contents of the scroll. The contents of the scroll come later. Yeah. You're right. So that would have been, and there's probably multiple ways that were done. The scrolls could have even been done differently, but you would have, generally speaking, the majority of the text would have been around one side, like this, and then you pop open the seal and you move it this way. But they also could have been sealed in the front just to keep the whole thing sealed together too. But the idea here mostly is the seal. These are the beginnings of things. Okay? This is the opening up of stuff. So it's the beginning of the birth pangs. And again, I think when you look at the contents of the events of chapter 6 of Revelation, you see a really close mirror image to what's taking place in Matthew 24. The events that Jesus says aren't the end, but just the beginnings. Now again, our goal is Revelation 21, the new heavens and new earth. So we're starting the process here. That's the picture. So he opens the first seal. And we have the calling of this figure on a horse with a bow and a crown. Now, the first question you might ask is, who are these figures on the horses? Well, it doesn't really say, just says they show up. Now, there is some conjecture, some guessing, some speculation that the rider of the first horse on this white horse might be, in fact, Christ himself, because he's given a crown. He's on a white horse. And in Revelation chapter 19, we will see, in fact, Christ himself on a white horse with a crown. But I don't think that's what it is here. The most obvious being Christ is the one opening the seals on the scroll. It doesn't make sense for him to be opening the seal and then switch places. And it's just these four horsemen seem to have the same source. I don't believe that's actually the case. I just think these four horsemen, so to speak, are just called of God for this purpose. So this seal is opened, serving as the opening of the event, or the opening of this whole sequence here, and these four horsemen begin to make their way out. And by the way, these four horsemen are not unique to Revelation. They show up earlier in the Old Testament, and in particular, they show up in the prophet Zechariah. Zechariah is one of the last prophets you have in the Old Testament, right before Malachi. You've probably done a lot of reading in Zechariah recently. Zechariah, Malachi. And in Zechariah, I want to show this to you here. It's not an exact duplicate, but they are very similar. In Zechariah chapter 6, you have these four horses drawing four chariots. And the prophet Zechariah says in his passage, I lifted my eyes again. This is chapter 6, verse 1 of Zechariah. I lifted my eyes again and looked, and behold, four chariots were coming forth from between the two mountains, and the mountains were bronze mountains. And the first chariot were red horses. Second chariot, black horses. The third chariot, white horses. So we've got those three repeated. And the fourth chariot, strong dappled horses. That's a little different there. And I spoke and said to the angel who was speaking with me, what are these, my Lord? The angel replied to me, these are the four spirits of heaven going forth from after standing before the Lord of all the earth, with one of which the black horses are going forth to the north country, and the whites go forth after them, while the dappled ones go forth to the south. And in verse 7, he says, they go patrol the earth. Zechariah chapter 1, he's got a similar, shorter sequence about these four horsemen going and patrolling the earth. So who are these four horsemen in Revelation chapter 6? Are they the exact same characters that we see in Zechariah chapter 6? I can't say for sure, but it seems like a good place to start. And I would rather do that than start going into all other kinds of guesswork. We talked about this last week. We're talking about the scroll. If there is a biblical precedent for something, let's go with that first, as opposed to trying to speculate somewhere else. So if these are the same four horsemen, so to speak, that we see in Zechariah, these are ones that God has, servants that God has set up that have patrolled the earth, so to speak, and now he's giving them this particular role here. But this imagery in Revelation 6 is not new to Revelation. You see it again in the Old Testament in the prophet Zechariah. So the first one, he has a bow and a crown. He sits on a white horse. And he has been given power to conquer and conquering and to conquer. So this obviously has the idea of war. Jesus talks about Matthew 24, nation rising against nation. This has got the idea of an external conflict, one country attacking another country, one people against another people. That's pretty straightforward. The bow in particular, generally, if you're in the Roman world, the bow and arrow would not really be your symbol of war. It would be a sword. While they had archers, that wasn't what Rome was mostly known for. Rome was known for their legions, their foot soldiers, shields, swords, and how they fought in that way. This is probably, again, if you're in first century ancient world, in the Roman world, if you're in the churches in Turkey, or what was Turkey now, what was Asia Minor then, this is probably bringing up a picture of a group of people called the Parthians. Now, the Parthians were an empire that was on the far eastern borders of Rome, what we might think of today as modern-day Iran, Iraq, kind of in that general direction out east of the Roman Empire. They were known at that time in history in that part of the world to be the best archers in the world. They had mastered the art of riding on horseback and shooting accurately with a bow and arrow. They were scary to the people of the Roman Empire, and especially to the ones on that eastern border. Now, it doesn't mean that the Parthians are the ones invading here. It's just meant to evoke an image of a scary army out there that could come in and invade and cause havoc at any time. That's just the image that he's trying to evoke here. So it would have been a scary thing. If you are in the heart of Rome, for the most part, you're probably not worried about some invading army. But if you're a little bit farther east of the Roman Empire and you know about these Parthian guys having a horse with a bow and a crown, now that's getting a little nervous because those guys could just show up here and cause some real trouble at any point in time. So that, again, we're talking about less getting into what kind of a war this is than we're just talking about a general atmosphere. Don't miss the forest for the trees here. So we have a scary invading army. In addition, he says the second horse comes on the scene and says, a red horse, and it was granted on him to take peace from the earth, and that men would slay one another, and a great sword was given to him. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, what's the difference between war and a lack of peace? Kind of seems like the same thing, right? I mean, if someone's at war, if someone's attacked you, you're probably not at peace with them. Kind of seems to kind of go already hand in hand. So what's going on here? Well, likely the second one here is dealing less with the idea of conflict out there, like an outside invasion, so much as it's dealing with conflict inside. The idea that there's division. So the difference might be horse number one, they're attacking us from over there. Horse number two, we're fighting each other in here. Civil war. Internal terror. Can't trust them, can't trust you, can't trust, and they're going after each other. That's kind of the idea here. So these two taken together, there's no peace out there, and there's no peace in here. There's violence out there, and now there's violence in here. There's no place to rest. There's no safe haven. That's the picture here. You've got no place to hide. So whether you're walking home at night, whether you're going to your job, or whether you're in the army and you're on the borderlands, everywhere you go, you are in danger. That's the idea here. Nobody can be trusted. So conquest from outside, conflict, violence, even on the inside. Now, I want to pause here before we get to the next couple of horses. I want to look at this concept a little bit. What is it? Just looking at our world around us and considering these two ideas, an attacking outsider and conflict and warring inside, so to speak. Let's look at these two ideas together here. What is it that causes a people who are supposedly on the same side? Let's say you're part of a country, there's the enemies out there, but what causes a people to turn on one another? What causes that? Now, without getting political now. Okay, distrust. I think it's a big thing what's going on here. And the reason I say that is this. this idea of a people turning on one another and essentially defeating themselves that way is not unique to Revelation 6, is it? Are there instances in Scripture where God uses this particular weapon, if you will, to defeat Israel's enemies? Okay. Gideon. Yeah. So, if y'all remember the story of Gideon in the book of Judges, the Midianites are coming in, and so 300 of Gideon's men surround them, bang on some vases, light some torches, and yell. And what do these 30,000 Midianite guys do in the middle of the valley? They turn on each other. They freak out. They panic. And despite the fact there's only 300 people out there, 30,000 guys kill themselves fighting one another. And we look at that and go, well, those are idiots. But obviously we recognize the activity of God in that process. But by the way, that's not the only time that happens. In fact, this happens on a pretty regular basis in the Old Testament, or at least some version of it. Let me tell you another one. In the book of 2 Chronicles, a guy named Jehoshaphat is the king of the southern kingdom of Judah. And in this particular account in 2 Chronicles, the Moabites, the Ammonites, and the Edomites have all joined forces to attack Israel, or to attack Judah in particular. And so the night before the battle, God comes to the people of Israel, comes to Jehoshaphat and tells them, tomorrow you're going to go out to battle, but don't you take a weapon. I've got this taken care of. They go out the next day. Jehoshaphat and his army go out the next morning, and they arrive to find that the Edomites and the Ammonites and the whichever one it was, all the ites had gotten confused in the middle of the night. And what they started doing when they got confused and afraid? They killed one another off. The Israelites show up the next morning, and the enemies have killed themselves because they were confused, terrified, and they turned on one another. This happens several times in the Old Testament. Revelation 6 is describing something similar. You've got the enemies from without, but the people inside are also turning on one another because they're confused, they're scared, they're terrified, all those things. And so what you have now is you have conflict out there and conflict in here. I'll let you arrive at whatever conclusion you want to arrive to as far as the danger in God's people turning on one another. God's people should never do this. Yes? You're right. I hadn't thought about that, Maxie, but you're absolutely right. That's Cain and Abel. Same thing. One turns on the other. And whatever the motive in their minds, the reality is that's a result of fear, it's a result of confusion, it's a result of those types of things, and so they turn on one another. So it goes back to the beginning, Cain and Abel. You're absolutely right. So this is what's happening. And let me just give you one more reference here. This is, by the way, again, a pattern that God allows. When we're looking at these seal judgments, these seals in particular, while there is a judgment aspect to them, there is more of a feel to these things that it's like God is almost removing some of his restraining power and letting the people of the world do what the people of the world do. That's kind of the feel of this whole thing. And let me take you to something. Romans chapter 1, a little different context here, but Paul is describing in Romans chapter 1 the days of this world. And he says in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, says, "For since the creation of the world, as God's invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and of birds, and of four-footed animals, and crawling creatures. Therefore, God gave them over in the lust of their hearts to impurity so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served the creatures rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever and ever. For this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions. And we could go on there, but you get the picture. There comes a point in time when humanity has so rejected God that God just says, if that's what you want, here you go. And sometimes the worst thing God can do is give us what we want. And I would proffer out there that Revelation 6 is in some ways a description of a world getting what it is wanted. God out of the way, and Him saying, you want it? Here's what happens. And we get the wars and the rumors of the wars, and nations arising against nations, and we get all these things that take place in Revelation 6 as He's beginning to pop open these seals. So what comes next? Again, if you are in the first century, how was war done? Well, an invading army comes in, and they don't have high-tech supply lines that go back to 500 miles or 1,000 miles beforehand. So how's an invading army feed itself? They come in and take whatever they want. Army comes through your area. Guess what they're going to have? They're going to have all the things you got. And they're going to take everything away from you. So what are you left with? Burnt out fields, no crops, no stores, no animals. You got nothing. Which means what for you? Look at the third horse. When he broke the third seal, I heard the third living creature saying, "Come." I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. There was like a voice in the center of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius." Now, a denarius is essentially the equivalent of a day's wage. It's generally considered by people who study that part of history that you could feed yourself. Enough food for one day was about a tenth to 20% of a tenth to 1/5 of a denarius. So you worked all day long, and about a tenth to 1/5 of what you made would be enough to feed you for that day. All right? What this is saying, what these measurements are indicating is that a denarius, a full day's labor, will get you just enough to feed you for a whole day. So that means that roughly, from an inflation point of view, that food is somewhere between 5 to 10 times the normal cost. Because war. So now there's no food. Wheat was the more nutritious, more sustaining of the two grains. Barley was considered to be the poor man's grain. So if you were fairly well off, you were able to buy wheat. If you weren't, the poor person could get barley. And that 3 quarts of barley would have been enough to feed 3 people. But again, now, one day's wage is all you can do. I mean, you're working all you can work just to have enough food to eat in a given day. That's the idea here. So in other words, famine. There's not enough food. That's a pretty natural result of the war and the violence and the conflict that we've seen in these first two, isn't it? It just flows. So now we have war, we have conflict, we have violence, we have now famine. He does make a comment. He does say, don't damage the oil and the wine, that kind of being olive oil. So in other words, these are also staples of the day. Not everything is gone. It's a partial famine. There's still possible to survive. Even though the wheat and the barley are what you primarily eat, the oil and the wine are considered to be staples, but they're not quite so. You can live without wine. Even though back in that day, wine, everybody drank wine to drink because the water was usually contaminated, so you put a little bit of alcohol in the water to be able to drink it without getting sick. So wine there that day was not quite what we think of as wine today. But nonetheless, you've got a severe famine type issue going on. So what happens? I got war, I got conflict, I got terror, I got violence, I got famine. What happens next? The fourth seal and an ashen horse, the color of death, essentially, and you have death and Hades. And there's this picture of death being followed by Hades as the second character. Death is on the horse, and behind him is this other character, Hades, who's picking up all the dead bodies. That's the That's the result here. And he says that it's a fourth of the earth. That is, the implication there is a fourth of the world's population. Today, that'd be roughly 2 billion people. Not quite that, but between 1.5 and 2 billion people as a result of all that. Now, I'm not sure the point is to put numbers on this. It's not really the main thing at stake here. The main thing is going on is it gets bad. And this is just popping open the seals. This is just the beginning of the birth pains. This isn't even the real thing yet. Now, he goes on to say, listen, the death comes from killing with the sword, comes with killing the family, comes with pestilence. That's disease. We've been reminded of the power of viruses over the last year, haven't we? We were just talking about this a while ago. 1 year ago this week is when it all kind of went bluey. A year ago this coming Sunday was our last service before everything got shut down with COVID. So we've been reminded, and then the reality is not to dismiss COVID, but there are a lot more dangerous stuff out there than what COVID is. I've even read just in the last couple of weeks that there has been a new Ebola breakout in parts of West Africa. That's a much more deadly disease. If that ever got out, and that's not nearly as contagious as something like COVID has been, but if that ever got out on a massive scale, that would be incredibly deadly. So, pestilence, and even by the wild beasts of the earth. I mean, there's lions and tigers and bears. I'm waiting for the oh my. Because guess what? When all the food's gone, guess what else doesn't eat? All the animals. So guess what they turn to? Us. So this is the picture going on here. These four horsemen. Again, these four horsemen of the apocalypse, as we sometimes call them, are not unique to John. They find they're common parts of Jewish apocalyptic literature, and just is meant to call to mind all the things that come in with war and conflict and terror and disease, all those things happening. Now, once we get to verse 9, we have a little pause here in all this terror, and we go back to a view of heaven as this next seal is popped open. And we have a glimpse of the martyrs in heaven underneath or at the foot of the altar there in heaven. Now, what's going on here? Just again, so often in Jewish literature, their view of heaven was essentially a heavenly temple, a spiritual temple. The book of Hebrews talks about this a bit, that the temple that the people of Israel had, that God had given Moses the designs for, the tabernacle then, and ultimately the temple that became Solomon's temple and so forth, that there was a design there that God had given Moses about how the tabernacle was to be built, and the idea in Jewish literature is that's supposed to mirror the spiritual heavenly temple that God dwells in heaven. And so there was this idea of an altar. And it gives us the indication that the martyrs find themselves at the foot of the altar. That is, their blood has been shed. Now, at the altar of burnt incense, at the temple that was in Jerusalem or was in ancient Israel, that was where the sacrifices were made to God. So this idea is that you almost have the martyrs have shed their blood as a sacrifice of worship to God in this heavenly temple. That's a little bit of the image here. At least that's the placement of things. And the first thing that popped in my mind was Romans chapter 12. Now this verse may pop into your mind too. Romans 12:1 says this as far as us. Therefore, Paul says, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God. This is your spiritual service of worship. There is a sense here in Revelation 6 that the martyrs are there, their blood has been spilt, in part in their own act of worship. Now they are, what do we mean by that? They are there because of, there in verse 9, because of the testimony which they had maintained. Now, we've talked about this already. The word martyr, the word that we read martyr here in the New Testament, is a Greek word, martyros. It's the same word. And if you were an ancient Greek or an ancient Roman and you used that word, it was the word you just used for witness. It didn't necessarily have the idea of death behind it. It was just the idea of being a witness. If you were a martyr, you were called to be a witness to something. That's all the word meant. Now, over the course of time, especially in the Christian biblical world, biblical experience, the idea of being a martyr came to mean being a witness to, all the way up to the point of death. This is what I know to be true. I'm giving witness to this. Specifically, I'm giving witness to the resurrection and the life and the lordship of Jesus Christ. So I'm giving witness to that. I'm saying I experienced this, I've seen this, I know this to be true, so I'm giving witness to it. Even at the point of a sword, I will give witness to it. I will not deny what I know to be true. So martyr comes to take on that meaning for us of being a witness unto the point of death. So these martyrs, so to speak, are those who have given witness to the lordship of Christ even to the point of death. They have presented their bodies a living sacrifice. They have said, we will not turn from the worship and the truth of who God is, of who Christ is, even at the point of death, and we consider it to be a privilege to pour out our life for His worship and for the witness of the gospel in the same way that Christ did what? Gave His blood and His life for us. So this is an act of worship, these guys. So that's part of the image of going on here. We got the altar and this heavenly temple here going on. This is all wrapped up in this. Martyrdom here for these folks is not simply something that, a quote, honorable way to die. It is giving witness and worship and sacrifices of praise to God, even if it means death, because He's worth it. That's the picture. And they cried out with a loud voice, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, will you refrain from judging and avenging our blood on those who dwell on the earth?" There's this idea of vindication. Father, we gave our lives saying you are true. At which point in time are you going to act in such a way that vindicates us and proves to them that we were in fact telling the truth? When's that going to happen? The response is twofold. One, to give them a white robe, verse 11. We see these white robes all throughout Revelation. They are symbols of purity and righteousness. So the first thing that God does to vindicate the martyrs is to do what? He gives them the white robe, which is a symbol of, yes, you were in fact telling the truth. You were pure. You were right. Secondly, he says this, wait. Isn't that everyone's favorite answer to prayer? God, when are you going to do? And he says, wait. Don't you just love that answer? Sometimes he even says it here in Revelation. He even tells it to the folks here at the throne, at the altar. So he says, you're going to wait. And one of the reason he tells them you have to wait is because what? There in verse 11. The number of martyrs is not full yet. There's more to come. What might this indicate to us about the nature or the presence of believers during all this? They're still there. I'm going to let that sit there for a while. We'll get back to that here in the next few weeks. But I will give you this hint. I believe there's every indication in the book of Revelation and elsewhere in Scripture that there are believers on earth during this time. A lot of them. It's seen over and over again. And I would even suggest if you look at the biblical history of the way God deals with His people, they are always in the midst of those people who are being judged. They live in the middle of all that, whether it's the people of Israel in Exodus, living through the plagues, whether it's Israel being going in the various places they were captured by or exiled in. You see it happen all throughout history. I'll let that hang there. I'll let you guys think about that for a little bit. But just you might see if you know too much about Revelation end time ideas, that might be a little different than what you've heard elsewhere. There are martyrs. So that's the fifth seal. The sixth seal happens, and now we have some stuff that again looks like what Jesus was talking about there in Matthew chapter 24. We have earthquake, we have the sun becoming black, and we have the moon being made like blood. Stars in the sky falling to earth, and the sky split apart like a scroll. Now that's the scary stuff. I remember the first time I, as a young man, a teenager, back in the 80s, 1980s, that the first time I heard this, hey, the sky being split apart like a scroll. Now we have a good, one of my favorite hymns references that as well. With My Soul has that phrase in it. Really one of my top 2 or 3 favorite songs of all time. It Is Well With My Soul. And I remember my dad who preached, he talked about this. He'd read that he said that sky being split apart like a scroll is a description of what takes place in a nuclear explosion. Maybe, I don't know. The Bible doesn't say there's a nuclear explosion. It just says really bad stuff happens. All right? I know some of us want, and you may want me to tell you that such and such nation launches a nuclear strike against such and such nation, and this country invades this country. I'm going to tell you, I don't believe the Bible gives us those details. And we can speculate all we want to, but I think that speculation is empty because the Bible doesn't give us those details. I don't think we're even supposed to have those details. If you are listening to this, I want you to put yourself in the position of the people who John is writing this to initially back in the first century. They're hearing things like if you are living in the city of Thyatira or the city of Philadelphia or the city of Laodicea, like we looked at in those first couple of chapters of Revelation, and you hear something like this, are you thinking nuclear explosion? You don't know what nuclear bombs are. What are you thinking of when you hear the moon becoming blood red and the sun being darkened and things falling out of the sky and the sky being split apart? What are you thinking if you're in that part of the history? You're thinking death. You're thinking that the world itself is literally falling apart, right? These are not just merely disasters. These things, the sun being darkened, think even just a basic eclipse, or a blood, what we might call a blood moon. Those were considered by that day and age. Those were considered to be things that were omens. Okay? If you had a blood moon show up, or you had a meteor shower go through the sky, or a comet come through the sky, or you had an earthquake, or whatever, these were not just bad in and of themselves. They meant something else. They meant that what? Something worse is on the way. That's how they would have understood all this stuff. So yeah, it's scary in and of itself, but for them, they would have understood that to mean something more is coming. Now, reading this book, we know that there is, in fact, more coming. Earthquakes, for the moment. Jesus, again, he talks about that in Matthew chapter 24. Earthquakes in the Bible are often a sign of God's presence and God's coming up and showing up. Let's go back to Exodus again. The people of Israel have come out of Egypt, and they are now at Mount Sinai. And God shows up meeting with Moses on Mount Sinai. And what do we have at Mount Sinai? We have clouds, we have thunder, we have quaking earth. This, all Revelation 6 is telling us is, here these last verses, this last section is telling us, yeah, this is scary, this is bad. It's also a sign that there's more coming, including at some point down the road, God himself showing up. So while on the one hand we can look at this and freak out, and by the way, verse 15, what are the people of this world doing in verse 15? The Greek word means freaking out. It's the kings of the earth and the great men, the commanders of the rich, strong, slave, free men, hid themselves and they basically say to the world, to the mountains, kill us now. Because dying in an avalanche, dying with a rock falling on my head would be better than facing him. They're scared to death. Because they see in these signs, they see in these events, the coming of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and they don't want any piece of him right now. So all this, as scary as it might sound on one hand, is really just telling us that God's in the process of birthing a new world. He's in the process of showing up and taking matters into his own hands directly, so to speak. And for those who are his, there's some good things on the way. So as scary as this is, for those who are in Christ, it's really not, hopefully, as scary. Doesn't mean it will be easy. If we go back to the birth analogy, painful, even scary process, but at the end, hopefully, great joy. Just keep that analogy in our minds. Okay, we are wrapping up chapter 6. We actually went a little longer than we usually go, but we got through it all. And we will jump into the end of chapter 6 and into chapter 7 next Wednesday. If you're watching with us online, so glad you have joined with us tonight. We're going to take some time here to pray. I would encourage you to take a few moments to pray, maybe even to respond to some things we talked about tonight. If you have some prayer requests you would like as a church for us to know about, would you please message us on Facebook or email us? Let us know that. We would be happy to keep those things in prayer. But if you're watching with us online, thank you for joining us. Y'all have a good evening.